worldview outside of the global north, including women, indigenous peoples, global south peoples, including internal colonies, and subsistence farmers. In other words, is the scale an adequate tool for measuring the environmental worldview of the global majority of people? In order to respond to this thesis question in my presentation, I will introduce you to the NEP, which is short for New Environmental Paradigm, introduce you to Materialist Ecofeminism, which I use to analyze this scale, provide an example of the analysis of theoretical framework that contributed to the scale's development, provide an example of a question determined inadequate and one determined adequate, and finally make a recommendation regarding the scale's use. According to Riley Dunlap and Kent Van Leer, if you were to answer this set of questions, they would then be able to measure the level to which your worldview adheres to a pro-environmental paradigm. Questions that have an asterisk are reverse coded, meaning that if you were to answer them in the positive, it would indicate anti-environmental view. In my thesis project, I systematically analyzed each question through a materialist ecofeminist analysis to determine their accuracy for the world's majority of people, that is women, indigenous peoples, global south peoples, and subsistence farmers. In 1978, Dunlap and Van Leer published the New Environmental Paradigm Scale. The scale was created in the context of growing environmental movements in the US, which culminated in the passage of acts like the Clean Air Act and Water Quality Act in the 60s, and the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act in the 70s, and with the founding of the EPA and the original celebration of Earth Day also in the 70s. The scale has been in use for over 40 years and has been cited over 5,000 times in published academic papers. It is used not just in the United States, but globally as a tool for measuring environmental worldview. I wanted to study the scale because to me, it seemed centered in global north ideas with some problematic talking points regarding what it means to be pro-environmental. On the other hand, it also seemed to borrow information that is readily available in traditional ecological indigenous knowledge or traditional women's knowledge and to frame it as new knowledge. The photo on the left is a child protesting the Love Canal, which was a landfill in Niagara Falls, New York, which was used as a dumping site for chemical manufacturing facility, which correlated with serious community health issues and with cases of leukemia. And these protests were notably organized by mothers, including Lois Gibbs, who is in the right picture with her children. Ecofeminism in academia arose around the same time that the NEP was published, entering academic works around 1975. It rose out of the feminist and environmental movements. The premise of ecofeminism is that the ecological and feminist movements are intertwined. There cannot be a successful environmental movement without feminism, and there cannot be a successful feminist movement without ecology. The presence of feminism in the environmental movement has been fundamental because based not on biology, but based on social roles that women fulfill in society, women are especially attuned to responsibilities to the home and children and respond to threats in these domains accordingly. To ecofeminists, the exploitation of the environment and women are linked, wherein women are viewed as nature and their reproductive and life-sustaining labor is viewed as an extension of natural processes rather than legitimate labor. Women are treated as a natural resource and are exploited as the earth is also exploited. Similarly, women are in a position to respond to ecological crises because of the way in which they have fulfilled reproductive and nurturing roles across history. Materialist ecofeminists look specifically at the way in which material conditions inform relationships of exploitation. So in order to address ecological and gendered exploitation, one would work to change material conditions, such as through political and economic organization. Ecofeminism was recently termed in the 1970s, but is not a new knowledge. Feminist methodology is based on these 6 principles. And in addition, I, as a researcher, am well qualified to speak from the position that lived experience affords me. as a woman who has engaged in the practice of environmental activism, as well as raising 2 children. Of course, lived experience is not scientific in and of itself, but combined with methodology, it creates a more full and comprehensive perspective. And this is one of the key points of feminist methodology. We aren't able as researchers to be wholly impartial, and therefore we identify the ways in which we are partial and are forthright and communicative about that throughout the research process. As part of my work, I analyzed the theoretical framework which informed the development of the NEP scale. This was made possible by an article Riley Dunlap published in 2008 titled The New Environmental Paradigm Scale from Marginality to Worldwide Use, in which he described key authors and works which informed the process of creating the original scale. I analyzed works by authors Paul Ehrlich, Garrett Hardin, and John Muir, who I will review now. John Muir is known as the father of national parks, and he helped form and was the first president of the Sierra Club. As part of my thesis, I analyzed his 1911 publication, My First Summer in the Sierra. In 2020, the Sierra Club released a statement titled Pulling Down Our Monuments, which can be Googled, which describes John Muir as supporting white supremacy, perpetuating racism against Indigenous and Black peoples, and even befriending Harry Fairfield Osborn, who co-founded the American Eugenics Society in the United States. In my analytical review of My First Summer in the Sierra, these dynamics were made visible throughout the book. One way that he has perpetuated racism is through the pristine wilderness myth. This is the myth that wilderness is to be separated from humans and to be kept pristine. However, this concept is ignorant to the peaceful cohabitation of humans and nature for millennia. In America, this was true prior to the European settler colonial project, which brought capitalism to replace an indigenous ethical economic model described by Dennis Martinez, which I review in my thesis. From an ecofeminist view, humans have lived the majority of their history as an important component of the ecosystem, shaping the ecosystem in positive ways. Removing indigenous peoples from their historic land and promotion of a perfect wilderness is a form of colonization that John Muir supported. It can be seen in the NEP scale the way in which this ideology affected the development of the questions. For example, question 5. When humans interfere with nature, it often produces disastrous consequences. This question was determined to be inadequate for measuring the environmental worldview of women, Indigenous peoples, Global South peoples, and subsistence farmers. Researchers Smith and Coleman suggest that this question is anthropocentric and that it does not recognize the interdependence among all species. Traditional ecological knowledge recognizes human nature interdependence and holds that humans can interact with nature based on an ethics of respect. In other words, it is possible to respectfully interact with nature. It is crucial that Indigenous peoples directly and/or significantly inform ecological restoration because Indigenous knowledge and culture is a part of place-based ecology. In this picture, an Indigenous woman in California holds her baby in front of a prescribed burn. The prescribed burns have been practiced by Indigenous tribes in California for millennia. They reduce the danger of massive wildfires that we've seen increasing, especially over the last decade in the West. They also encourage vegetative regrowth of particular plants that thrive from smaller burns. This results in a more resilient and a more productive landscape. In this NEP question, interference with nature is explained only in the negative and only in the context of disaster. But truthfully, humans have interacted with and shaped nature for a very long time. In my research, I found that of the 12 NEP questions, 8 were not adequate for measuring the worldview of women, Indigenous peoples, Global South peoples, and subsistence farmers, while 4 questions could be considered adequate. This is an example of one of the questions considered adequate. And as I stated before, it's reverse coded, meaning that if a respondent said yes, this would indicate anti-environmental view. This question is appropriate because under no context in materialist ecofeminism are humans meant to rule over nature. However, materialist ecofeminist theory goes to a deeper level of analysis and points out that domination over nature is part of the same structure that creates the conditions of exploitation, structural sexism, and colonization. So while Dunlap and Van Leer did not connect the domination of nature to the domination of women, they do acknowledge that the belief that humans were meant to rule over nature is an anti-environmental belief. Val Plumwood, who was a prominent ecofeminist, described her experience surviving 3 death rolls in a crocodile attack in the Australian bush in the book The Eye of the Crocodile, which was published after her death decades later. It was through this experience that she physically and mentally embodied the knowledge that humans are not exempt from being prey, and that we are both predators and prey in the food chain. And that is what this image represents. Like I've previously said, the NEP scale borrows information that is readily available in traditional ecological indigenous knowledge or traditional women's knowledge and frames it as new. At the same time, the premise of the scale is also rooted in a global north ideology, which renders the majority of questions inadequate for measuring the worldview of women, indigenous peoples, global south peoples, and subsistence farmers. It's outside the scope of my thesis to recommend a replacement scale or another scale in environmental sociology as a more accurate quantitative tool. However, it is clear that environmental worldview is culturally informed and that the material reality of different populations, and especially colonized populations, creates an entirely different environmental worldview than can be seen, for example, in wealthy global north nations such as the United States. So I do recommend that the NEP scale is phased out of quantitative environmental sociology research as a general quantitative scale. Even if used in the global north, it cannot be used consistently as it represents a biased point of view that is not universally applicable. Thank you so much for attending my presentation, and I will now take questions. And if you're interested, I do have the results table.
Great, Carly. I'm going to stop recording, but you can leave that up if you want.
Okay.